Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Dominique Wright from the Department of Agriculture and Food in Western Australia, and today we are speaking to Svetlana Misic from our Albany office about snails. So good afternoon, Svet.
Good afternoon, everybody. One of the things that we've been having a lot of issues in parts of the southern parts of the state is snails, and we do have 4 different types of snails present in Western Australia. However, the most common and the one that's found over all soil types is the small pointed snail. There is no silver bullet for the control of these snails. Everybody would like there to be a simple solution, but there isn't. And with snails, you do need to use a multi-pronged approach. Doing just one thing may not get the best management practices that you have. However, if you don't have snails, look, it doesn't mean that you're not going to get them. Everybody that has snails here once upon a time didn't actually have them, because snails were introduced to every single property that has snails today, and the only way that you can keep snails out is by maintaining good biosecurity. Now, the 4 species that we have are the white Italian, the vineyard snail, the small pointed and the large pointed snail. These are found throughout different parts of Western Australia. However, the white Italian and the vineyard snail have a limited distribution. These snails are predominantly found only on alkaline soil types, and they are not really found throughout the broadacre cropping areas. The large pointed snail is one of the main pests in South Australia. It has a very limited distribution in Western Australia. To date, it's found only on one broadacre paddock, and it is found elsewhere, mainly around the suburban areas of Perth. The small pointed snail, however, is found throughout Western Australia. It's found over all soil types, and it is a range that extends from pretty much Esperance up through to Dongara. Now, the 2 white Italian and vineyard snails are commonly known as round snails, and the small pointed is also known as the small conical snail. To get good control of snails, you need to break the life cycle. The small conical snail and the round snails all breed once a year about autumn, and it takes a year for the eggs to reach sexual maturity. And these snails can live for more than 2 years, and one of the biggest issues that we do have is if the snails lay their eggs in autumn, come harvest time, you can actually find that the snails are the same size as the seed, so it's very difficult to sieve them out of grain. The small pointed snail has a burrowing habit, so it can burrow underground, but it can also clamber up onto seed heads and can be a grain contaminant. The round snails tend to climb up onto crops. They don't tend to be found on the ground as often. And during summer, the snails are quite able to survive a hot, dry summer, either by climbing up into stalks or burrowing at least 5 centimetres underground. So to control them, you really need to bait or do something to reduce their numbers before their eggs are laid in autumn. To date, we've found that baits work the best as a chemical control for decreasing the snails. What we've also found works very well is you can get a very good control by burning, and especially windrow burning. You can decrease the populations of all the snail species by 95%. However, our soil types in Western Australia are not very conducive to burning, so that may pose an issue on some soil types. Now, reducing weeds or reducing stubble through herbicide applications, or reducing stubble by grazing or by removing the stubble, doesn't necessarily kill the snails. Reducing weeds means that there is less of a food source available to snails over summer. Now, the snails do not feed if it's a hot, dry summer. They actually estivate, which means they climb up and they estivate over summer and don't feed. And if there's no weeds present, that means that the baits that you apply in autumn actually don't have anything to compete with, and you are more likely to get a better kill because the weeds provide an alternative food source, and they also provide alternative harbourage for the snails over summer, so they provide habitat for them to survive a hot, dry summer. Also, the presence of stubble also helps them survive a hot, dry summer. Now your only option, if you miss the boat in autumn and the snails do lay eggs and they do cause crop damage, after crop damage is starting, the only option is to bait, and the snails may or may not take up the bait. Now, if you do bait for snails, you will not get 100% kill by baiting. Trials that we did in the lab basically showed that no matter what bait type you used, whether it was a metaldehyde bait, a thiocard-based bait, or an iron-based bait, at most we got between 65 to nearly 68% kill. So baits will not kill off a small pointed snail population by 100%, and that's simply because these snails do not only feed on green plant material, they also feed on organic matter, so they may not readily go for baits. One of the other things that we found in some of the other trial work that we did was that the white Italian snails, when we did the same experiment, we actually got 100% mortality by exposing the white Italian snails to baits, and we got less than 10% mortality for the small pointed snails. And this all comes down to the age of the snails. Now, the white Italian were large mature snails and they actively fed on the baits. The small pointed snails in this trial were immature, so they were less than half a centimetre, at least about 3 mils, and they did not actively feed on the baits. So what this shows is that if you have an older snail population, so they're all sexually mature, you're probably more likely to get at least 60% kill by using baits. But if you have an immature population, so your snails have laid their eggs in autumn and they've all hatched, you may not get a kill of the immature snails if you apply baits after they've hatched. You may need to wait until next year. Now, every grower has wanted a spray, and we've been asked continually if we could apply sprays for the control of snails, especially sprays that are registered in horticulture. Now, we did a trial where there were small pointed snails with at least 200 per square metre. Now, this was done in a canola crop. What we basically found was that if you baited, you got by day 20 about 30 plants per square metre. However, if you sprayed or did nothing, we actually only got just over 15 plants per square metre. So really, baits are your best option. Now, there are sprays registered for the control of snails in horticulture. However, due to the water rates that are being used, they are not effective in broadacre cropping. Now, the increase in snail numbers doesn't happen overnight. Some growers expect that this has been something that's just suddenly occurred, but it hasn't. It takes years for snails to build up in sufficient number to actually cause crop damage. The first precursor or suggestion that you might be having snails building up in number is that you are finding snails in grain at harvest, and that suggests that snails are increasing. Now, the other thing that increases snail survival is available habitat over summer. So that means long-term min-till paddocks with increased soil moisture retention do tend to increase the survivability of snails over a hot, dry summer. The other thing is that liming doesn't bring the snails to your paddock. The addition of lime increases the strength of a snail shell because snails actively feed on soil to get sufficient lime, calcium carbonate to build their cells, to build their shells. So if you do happen to lime, it doesn't mean that you've brought in the snails, because that's when most people start to notice an increase in number. It usually means that the lime has increase the strength of the snail shell, and research by Sardi suggests that the increasing the snail's shell density also does increase their fecundity. So really your only option is to bait, and you really need to bait effectively. And if you do have an even distribution of baits and apply the baits, at least 30 baits per square metre, you're actually in with a much better chance. Thank you.